Just give it another moment or two as it populates. For those of you who have joined us, we're just waiting another moment or two for some additional people to populate into the webcast, so please bear with us. Okay, well, for those of you who have joined us, we welcome you this evening for what I know will be a very interesting, informative webcast. Welcome. My name's Elliot Karp. I am the CEO of Hillels of Georgia. And on behalf of the more than 5,000 Jewish students across 24 campuses in our state, I welcome you to this program this evening. We're thrilled to be able to host two outstanding speakers, Ambassador Dennis Ross and David Makovsky. And without further ado, I would like to turn this evening's program over to Amanda Cohen, one of our tremendous Hillel student leaders at Emory University in Atlanta. Amanda, thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliot. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name is Amanda Cohen. I'm from Short Hills, New Jersey, and I'm a junior at Emory studying psychology on a pre-law track. I will be co-moderating this event with my colleague, Ben Lefkowitz, and I really hope that you all enjoy this program. I'll be introducing the speakers tonight. Ambassador Ross is counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and teaches at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. He played a leading role in shaping US foreign policy in the Middle East in the George H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations. Ambassador Ross served as special assistant to President Obama and was senior director for the Central Region of the National Security Council. He also served as special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Ross is the author of several influential books on the peace process, the Middle East, and international relations. His most recent book, co-written with his Washington Institute colleague, David Makovsky, is Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. Mr. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel Relations. He is an adjunct professor in the Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies. Mr. Makovsky served as the senior advisor to the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the US State Department. He has testified before the full US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and the full US House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs. In addition to co-authoring a book with Ambassador Ross, he has authored numerous Washington Institute monographs and essays on issues related to the Middle East peace process and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Ambassador Ross and Mr. Makovsky. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amanda, for introducing us, Elliot, and thank you all for your hospitality. I mentioned a couple of you in my last campus I visited before COVID was Emory, and I remember talking to Ken Stein's class of we had like 125 people, and you know, I thought it was just going to be a regular visit, and it turned out to be the last one before the pandemic. So I look forward to seeing you guys in person after the pandemic. The way we're going to do it, sorry, is that I will focus a bit on Arab-Israel normalization, the Israeli-Palestinian issue going forward with the Biden administration. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dennis, and he will discuss the issue of Iran, which is going to be a large question in the foreign policy of the Biden administration. So let me start off here by saying, and we'll show you a map, but before we get into the map and everything like that, I just want to say a word about people-to-people peace, because the peace between Israel and Arabs, between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt, Egypt being the first peace, Jordan being the second, these were strategic agreements that ended a state of war between countries. What's so exciting about this is that it really holds forth the promise of people-to-people peace. And we're going to discuss the economics, the high tech, but I would just say if I was a college student today, I would want to follow this space, because if you're interested in Israel, or if you're interested in technology, or you're interested in business, this is something that's brand new and I think has a lot of potential. So why don't we go to the map, and just to orient people a sense of where we are. The Middle East, you guys know where Israel is, right there. Follow Sheridan's arrow. And then we're going to 5 o'clock down there to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Its capital is Abu Dhabi. Its tourism attraction is Dubai. And right like 11 o'clock from there is Manama, the capital of Bahrain. That was the second breakthrough on Arab-Israel normalization. Sudan, you see further afield. Morocco, I don't know if we've seen on this map, but we have a map there too. We'll get to in a second. But I think what's significant is Iran, right across from the Persian Gulf and at a key choke point, and that's the Straits of Hormuz, where much of the world's oil passes through. And the Iranians have a lot of military installations on their side. And there's a sense that peace with Israel, normalization with Israel is significant, because there's a need, as when I was in Abu Dhabi before COVID also, they said to me, David, we don't know if America will stay in the Middle East. We hear all the talk about energy independence, that the Middle East isn't as important to America, but we know one thing, that if there's a country that cannot leave the Middle East, it's Israel, because they live in the Middle East. And so at a time of American retrenchment, you had both the Obama and the Trump administration pull back forces from the Middle East. These countries, and they hear about the energy dynamics, their view is, okay, who's going to be there when if we face some confrontation with Iran? So I think if you want to say what drove it was a sense of broader context of where is this region going? And that sense of aligned regional thinking about destabilizing forces is critical. So that's one big factor that drove it. A second factor that drove it was the economics, and we have a slide on that. And that is this: if you look at the economics here, what you see is it's almost, I would say, a merger between Google and Microsoft, but it's the two countries that are the most globalized, the most free market oriented in the Middle East, Israel and the Emirates. Their GDP is roughly very similar. And even in terms of per capita GDP, it's very similar at over $40,000. But the Emirates has over $1.3 trillion in the sovereign wealth funds, which is to look for high-tech startups and other things that could provide good investments. And here, it's the marriage between Gulf capital and an Israeli technological entrepreneurial spirit. You've heard and you've read the book, all that's about Startup Nation, with Israel having 6,000, many say more, startups. But now you could have Gulf funding to assist. And not to mention tourism. It is said that 70,000, we've even seen numbers up to 140,000 Israelis have traveled to the Emirates during a pandemic. All right, just to put these in perspective, before the pandemic in 2019, 4.3 million Israelis traveled abroad. That's just under half the entire country, including babies and everyone. So imagine the possibilities. People say trade could easily get to 4 billion. But if 70,000 people are willing to travel during a pandemic, it tells you something about the potential going forward. And so, again, I always want to say, what's the big picture, folks? The big picture is that the Gulf states think that the end of oil, the oil age is looming, and they're trying to diversify their economies in that post oil age. And they feel Israel, with its technology, could assist them, could help them when it comes to cyber, could help them when it comes to financial technology, communications, medical equipment, green tech, agri-tech, all sorts of ways, desalination that could help countries in Africa as well. I think this could be an amazing combination. So that's the second big picture that drove it. And there's another thing that I think is worth pointing out, which is something that is not as discussed as much in the media about more, not as much the motivation, but as the consequence of this. And that is the start, and I don't want to overstate, but a new discourse on Israel and Jews and Judaism in the Middle East. As you know, there's been, unfortunately, a lot of anti-Semitic coverage over the decades about Israel in the Arab media. I just appeared on one 2 hours ago, but you can really tell the difference in recent years. And look, you see the menorah to your right and Dubai, and there's a lot of other things here. You have the foreign minister wishing Shana Tova to Israelis, but look up to your right above, the 3 buildings that are going up. The Pope dedicated it, the only place in the Arab world. There'll be a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, with the mosque facing Mecca and the synagogue facing Jerusalem in Abu Dhabi. This is really exciting. And it relates also, we have a slide of Prince Bandar bin Sultan of Saudi Arabia on the right. He did like a 3-part seminar, prime time, Arab media, Al Arabiya, one of the biggest Arab satellite channels. And he said, look, I was at the center of things and he worked very closely with Dennis, who you're going to hear from. And he said, we didn't talk publicly about all the mistakes that were made by the Palestinians. They weren't always the victims. We had a chance here and they missed a lot of opportunities. And in that discourse, it's a reframing also of Israel. Not always the victimizer, but someone that was sincere about peace. So this is something that I don't want to overstate it, but getting that message out is key. And to the left, another role of Saudi Arabia, Bandar was the Saudi ambassador to the United States. His daughter is now the current ambassador, Princess Reema. But the Saudis behind the scene were key. They were allowed Israeli El Al direct flights to the United Arab Emirates instead of having to fly all around the Gulf. Instead of 8 hours, it's 3 hours and 20 minutes. And as the Bahraini senior official said, David, no way we could have done this on our own without the Saudi permission. I said, of the king? He said, yes. I said, was it a yellow light or green light? He said, I'd say it was blinking green. But I think the Saudis played a behind the scenes role. Dennis has been, I should add, particularly involved on the Saudi side and could give you more on this. But I think it's fascinating that while the Saudis themselves have not wanted to normalize, they're not wanting, but at the same time, they don't want to stop others and have praised the move as an honorable move. So this is something, and I want to come back to that in a moment. So there's a Saudi angle to this too. And then people say, well, where can it go from here? And here we have like a little table for you. Morocco, here's that photo, the picture of Morocco, where you've had 50,000 Israelis visit Morocco, even though there weren't direct flights. Now there will be direct flights. They're reopening their liaison office. And if they get a reaffirmation on certain things from the Biden administration, will be full diplomatic relations. I think there could be some moves with the Saudis on normalization. I don't know if it'll be full normalization. And that gets us to the Palestinian issue. because I think here the question is, what can be done? Look, if you are Palestinian, here's the Zoom call that you witnessed, which is that on Zoom, here we are, the Palestinians were basically isolated. On the Arab League said, we're for this peace normalization. And when the Palestinians tried to stop it, they said, no, every country is sovereign to make their own decisions. In the Arab world, in 1979, when the Egyptians made peace, the Arab League relocated in protest for 10 years. But I think the key to peacemaking is to assess, is this a bypass road or a bridge? It's clearly a new paradigm. And if you care about Israel, you should care about this issue, because just because the Palestinians are losing doesn't mean Israel has won. But the point here is that the old paradigm since 2002 was, we won't do anything with Israel until the Palestinians get what they want. If they get what they want, then we'll talk to you guys. But for 18 years, that paradigm has not worked. And I think that the countries that, in 2002, they didn't think they had many bilateral interests with Israel. But between the, post 9/11, the Arab Spring, the issue of, clearly the issue of ISIS, the Iranian regional footprint growing in the Middle East, all of a sudden they've said, listen, we've deferred our interests. Israel's not the enemy. Israel could be part of a solution. So the question here is, we're not willing to be held hostage to an old paradigm that never worked. But I think the question today is, can this be a bridge and not a bypass road? There are people on the right edge of the end zone that say it's a bypass road around the Palestinians, and they're thrilled. There are people at the left end zone who say this is a bypass road, and they are thrilled and they mourn it. But Dennis and myself represent, and the Washington Institute, a more centrist, kind of middle of the field position that says, hey, this is a bridge. This is a way to use Arab states to bring Israelis and Palestinians closer. And I think that is, going to be a challenge for the Biden administration. Is there a way to somehow think out of the box and say, hey, you're going to bring Arabs and Israelis closer, and so doing, bring Israelis and Palestinians closer? What we saw with Egypt, we saw with Jordan, is that only when these countries make peace with Israel are they more interested in others joining the circle of peace, because they don't want to be alone. So I think this is a possibility. And you have a Biden administration, of course, that's got to have other priorities. How could it not? With COVID, the economic aftermath of COVID. These are huge things. But at the same time, I think there's a desire by the Biden administration to end the boycott that has existed before. And I'm happy to talk about it. I just don't want to take up too much time here. Reopening a U.S. consulate in Jerusalem while maintaining the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem. And I think there are things that could be done. Can you build on normalization? You might not solve the conflict, but you could shrink the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So I think we got to think a bit out of the box here in this regard. And I mean, the last slide I'll just show, people say, well, what is possible, David? I mean, I think what's possible is maintaining the viability of a two-state idea. You might not reach two states, but here's our last slide I want to show you. I got a bunch more, but I don't want to take into Dennis's time. Most of the Israelis over the green line live, whether it's 77% or 84%, live in 7% of the land where the barrier is, the security barrier is. Maybe some of you have seen it. And so whether it's 74 or 84, 77 or 84%, only 5% of the Palestinians, 16% if you include East Jerusalem, are inside the barrier, while 95% of the Palestinians are outside the barrier. 23% of the settlers are outside. Can you imagine something where Israel says, listen, we're not going to, extend the, we're not going to build outside the barrier. Why? Not because we've solved all the problems. And here we have some maps for you. Not because we've solved all the problems, but we want to give a chance for our successors to solve the problems. The Venn diagram doesn't overlap between Israel and the Palestinian leadership. And Dennis and I wrote a book on the importance of leadership to change the dynamic. But so long as this is the leadership, I think the point here is what you want to do is at least keep the door open. You don't want to shut the door, because if you don't have the possibility even of two states, and it's going to slide to a one-state reality, sadly, that could change the dynamic in our country, the United States, because the DNA of Americans is one man, one vote, one person, one vote. And so you want to keep that idea open. You don't want people to say, well, we don't need Israel because we'll let all the Palestinians vote in Israeli elections, which would totally change Israel's character, its identity. And Israelis won't agree to that. But I think there's a way to keep that door open and to shrink this conflict. So it won't solve all the problems, but I think you're not precluding these options. I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A. I just don't want to take up more time. I just want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dennis Ross.
Okay, thank you, David. I just might add one point to what David was saying before I go on to the other part of our discussion. There are some who will say, look, the Israelis are winning, the Palestinians are losing, and Palestinians are being left behind. So, Israel doesn't have to change a thing. The problem is the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. And as one senior Arab official said to me, we actually don't have a Palestinian problem. The Israelis have a Palestinian problem. So Israel will need to come up with an approach. The essence of what David was saying is there is a whole new reality in the region that creates a new possibility, which is normalization. The Israelis and Palestinians, the gaps between them psychologically, the politics on each side, the substantive gaps, that's not a fruitful area where you're going to be able to transform things, but the normalization with Israel is something that creates the possibility for triangulating. In other words, public outreach by Arab states like the Saudis to Israel can be matched by steps that Israel takes towards Palestinians, and the Palestinians could reciprocate. That allows you to break the stalemate. Normalization as a general point is very important in the region as a whole, not simply for the reason I just said, but also because it also becomes part of the potential leverage against the Iranians. So let me use that as a segue to discussing the Biden administration in Iran and what's going on right now. The first thing is to sort of repeat something David said. The Middle East and Iran are not the priorities of the Biden administration. It's COVID, COVID, and COVID. It's an economic stimulus bill because the number of jobs we had increased in the last month was a fraction of what it should be, 49,000, which is a very small number. And it's a reminder that there is the economic consequences of COVID are quite severe. So getting over COVID, or at least getting through it by the summer, trying to restore some sense of normality here, being in a position where we can deal with being able to, in a sense, jumpstart the economy again. These are the main priorities. Internationally, the main priority is reestablishing the United States as a good global citizen. That's why on day one, President Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. It's why we moved very quickly back into the World Health Organization. The idea that we would leave the World Health Organization in the midst of a pandemic, when there has to be an international answer to the pandemic, we can't solve the pandemic on our own. Even here at home, we already see there are variants like the South African variant, which is unlikely to be treated as effectively by the vaccines that are available right now. Even the ones in this country, Moderna and Pfizer, they will not be as effective against the variant, although what they do, even when they can't prevent you from getting the South African variant, what the impact of them is that they assure that you won't get it that severely. It's like getting a flu shot. It doesn't guarantee you don't get the flu, but it guarantees you'll get the flu in a much milder form. So that again allows you to get back to a greater sense of normality. But what it tells you is if you don't have an international answer, if there aren't going to be vaccines available, even in those countries, the poor countries, then you will see variants, new variants of COVID emerge. So the focus internationally is not on the Middle East. It's on, in a sense, restoring American leadership in the world so that we can lead on issues like pandemics, on issues that don't respect borders, like climate change, nonproliferation, terror. all of these are, in a sense, the kinds of challenges that don't respect borders, and yet when the US doesn't lead, there's a vacuum. So for the Biden administration, the preoccupation on the outside is reestablishing American leadership, which also requires restoring America's alliances, because we can't carry the exclusive burden by ourselves. Now, the Iranians understand they're not part of the priority. They understand that. And they're trying to impose themselves on the Biden agenda. Why do I say that? Look at what their recent behaviors have been. It started shortly before the inauguration of Biden. You saw them suddenly enriched to 20%. When we talk about low enriched uranium, the dividing point between low enriched uranium and high enriched uranium is 20%. So when they enrich to 20%, it is a big deal, because high enriched uranium is basically what can produce weapons grade material. If you're going to have a bomb, you need high enriched uranium. Now, it's true, it's not at 20%, but what it takes to enrich to 20% takes you almost all the way to what you need to be able to do if you're enriching to weapons grade, which is 80 to 90%. They're enriching to 20%. Back in the year 2012, Bibi Netanyahu, before the UN, said, if Iran accumulates one bomb's worth of 20%, that's a red line for Israel, meaning we will act militarily against it. So here they are, they're now enriching to 20%. But at the same time, they're now fabricating uranium metal. That can be a form of fuel, but creating uranium metal, fabricating uranium metal is important for being able to encase and be able to produce a bomb. It doesn't mean it's the only thing you do it for, but you don't have much of a reason to be doing it unless, in fact, you are moving in that direction. Today, the intelligence minister of Iran said that, yes, the supreme leader issued a fatwa years ago against having nuclear weapons, but he said, if we're put in a corner, that could change, signaling that they might well be thinking about a nuclear weapon. They seized the South Korean ship. Last week, there were attacks on 2 separate days on the missile attacks on Riyadh, the capital city of Saudi Arabia. All this is designed to make the Iranian an issue that the Biden administration has to address. In other words, they're trying to force themselves onto the agenda. And what do they want? They want sanctions relief. Now, what are they prepared to pay for it? They say, and this is what the Supreme Leader said in a speech this week, it's not up to them, it's up to the Americans, because it's the US that withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Now, Biden has made it clear that he wants to return to the JCPOA, but he has a ground rule for doing it. His ground rule is compliance for compliance. In fact, if you take a step back, Biden has explained that his approach to Iran is shaped by 3 objectives. Number 1, Iran must never be allowed, and he is determined to ensure that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, number 1. Number 2, he's prepared to provide a credible path back to diplomacy for the Iranians based on compliance for compliance, meaning they are outside of compliance right now with the JCPOA. It is true they waited a year until after Trump had withdrawn before they began in a phased way to withdraw from the commitments they were obligated to fulfill under the JCPOA. Today, they have 10 to 12 times as much low enriched uranium as they're permitted to have under the terms of the agreement. They're enriching, as I said, to 20%. They're enriching that in a place where they're not supposed to be doing enrichment, in the Fordo complex, which is really a mountain complex. They have installed 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges, meaning 328 advanced centrifuges that are 6 to 10 times as efficient as the centrifuges they have used to accumulate their low enriched uranium. There are a series of things that they have done that actually shrink the time it would take them to break out to what's known as producing weapons grade fissile material. Depending upon whose estimate you believe, this is anywhere from 3 to 6 months now. At the time of the JCPOA, it was more than a year. So here is, when you say compliance for compliance, as President Biden and his Secretary of State are saying, it's not so simple because to get back into compliance will take the Iranians some time. And it's not so simple because they're saying they shouldn't have to do it. It depends upon the US. This is exactly what the Supreme Leader said in his speech yesterday. So it's not going to be a simple proposition to get back into the JCPOA. It'll take some time. Now, there are ways to work it out. There could be a step-by-step approach. The Iranians take a step, we take a step. But what you've got is the Iranians pushing for the US to take the first step, the administration saying it's up to the Iranians to take the first step. Can that be sorted out? Quite possibly, but I would say we'll know soon how important it is to the Supreme Leader to get early sanctions relief. If he sticks to the position he has and basically says there isn't a need for negotiations because all the US has to do is to go ahead, then it's telling you he's prepared to wait until after the June elections. If you see some movement on the Iranian side to resolve this, you'll see that sanctions relief is extremely important to him. So the key here is understanding this is not going to be simple, number one, but then again, no negotiation with the Iranians is simple. Now, the Israelis are very uneasy about going back, having the administration go back to the JCPOA. They're mostly uneasy because they see it legitimizing by the year 2030 a very large nuclear industrial base, a very large nuclear infrastructure for Iran. And if that's the case, and if it's the JCPOA, if there isn't a follow-on agreement to the JCPOA, then basically in the year 2030, there are no limits any longer on the Iran nuclear program. There will still be verification and monitoring going on, but there are no limits. And if there is the kind of infrastructure that the Iranians are talking about having, they will be able to have zero breakout time. And it's conceivable they could present the world with a nuclear weapons fait accompli, meaning before one could intervene to prevent it, they would actually have it. And then you have to think, what is the consequence of that? So Israel looks at the JCPOA, if nothing else is done, as legitimizing before the world Iran having a very large nuclear infrastructure that sooner or later could present the world with a nuclear weapons fait accompli. The Emiratis and the Saudis, they don't want the JCPOA, but not because they have a problem with the content. Their problem is they think the minute that the Iranians are back in the JCPOA and the US lifts all the nuclear related sanctions, they'll have no longer an incentive to negotiate anything else. It is true that the administration has learned that one thing that Trump succeeded in doing was proving that we can impose sanctions on our own. We could threaten others if they didn't respect our sanctions on things like the Iran Central Bank, that we would sanction them. Other governments didn't follow suit, but the international banking system did. Because if given a choice between doing business with the United States or Iran and losing the possibility of being able to have access to the American financial system, that wasn't a choice. So most of the international financial private sector, banking sector, have opted out of doing anything with Iran for fear of being sanctioned by the United States. So the administration thinks, well, maybe we can use that leverage to produce a follow-on agreement to the JCPOA that plugs its holes, its loopholes, and deals with this concern that the Israelis have about the sunset provisions lapsing effectively in the year 2030, at least on the big nuclear-related issues. Now, that's true, but it could take several years to produce that follow-on agreement. And in the meantime, the Iranians will continue, if they've had sanctions relief, which they get with the JCPOA, they'll be able to go back to doing what they're doing in the region and what they're doing with ballistic missiles. Two areas that President Biden has made it very clear he's determined to also to deal with. So the critical challenge for the administration is going to be, how do they convince the Israelis and the Gulf states? How do they convince the Congress that if they go back into the JCPOA, assuming that becomes possible, that they will retain leverage to deal with the other threats that the Iranians pose? And here I would just like to say, there are things that we could do that would demonstrate that even if we do go back in the JCPOA with all the potential difficulties that I was suggesting, there are things we can do to make it clear that we can raise the cost to the Iranians of what they do in the region. Let me give you a set of examples, and then we can turn it over to your Q&A. The first thing is to make it very clear, we will compete with the Iranians in the region. We will not turn a blind eye to it. We will compete. First thing that we can do is we can make it very clear that we will support what Israel is doing as it carries out basically attacks into Syria against what the Iranians are doing in terms not just of embedding themselves, but more importantly, Iran is pursuing a precision-guided project where it wants to be able to put terminal guidance on all the rockets and missiles it's provided to Hezbollah and to the rocket and missiles they're providing into Syria. Now, Hezbollah has 130,000 rockets. Now, not all of them have range to cover all of Israel or great payload, meaning they can't carry heavy bombs. But there are tens of thousands that can have that range that cover the state of Israel and that, in fact, have the ability to deliver real payload. Now, Israel, I don't need to tell any of you, is a small country with a very limited number of strategic targets, economic and political and military. If you're talking about tens of thousands of rockets, first they can saturate the Israeli missile defense system, which is really a network, and they can basically shut the country down. Israel won't live with that. And at some point it will act against that. So that's why it continues to carry out attacks into Syria. By my count, they've hit over 1,200 targets. And the message that we send is that we will support this. The Iranians need to know that because it imposes a price on the Iranians even as they pursue this. So that's the first thing we could do. We can obviously continue to make it clear that we will give the Israelis more capabilities as well to deal with the threats that they see coming from Iran. We can do more to bolster the Iraqi government against the Shia militias that basically the Iranians, they finance, they train, they arm. They are an extension, they're proxies of the Iranian government. They have enormous leverage within Iraq. They're known as the Hashd al-Shabi. These are the popular mobilization units. They're, as I said, largely a tool of the Iranians. But the more we build up the Iraqi military, the more we create political space for the Iraqi government, the Iraqi prime minister, to be able to make their own decisions and to have greater autonomy and freedom from the leverage that the Iranians can apply. We can create an integrated missile defense network to counter the developments of ballistic missile developments that the Iranians have. Interestingly enough, we wanted to do this with the Gulf Cooperation Council states. These are the 6 Arab states in the Arabian Peninsula: Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait. They've never been willing to create an integrated missile defense network. They wanted to have it bilaterally with us. It's much more effective. It's integrated. But now, because of the normalization process, we can go ahead and we can bring the Israelis into this with their command control and their radars. This will make the collective defense against the Iranian ballistic missiles much more effective, again, reducing the potential leverage the Iranians have and also the threat that they can pose. We can do contingency planning. We can organize contingency planning for the Israelis with the Gulf states to focus on how they create effective options against the Shia militias that the Iranians use for proxies throughout the region. Hezbollah is obviously one. There's a series within Iraq. You have also the Houthis in Yemen, who are somewhat different in category, but still, every time I hear someone say, well, they're really independent, they don't really follow the Iranians, except that their behavior is always supportive of the Iranians. And what do they chant? Death to Israel, death to Israel, death to the United States. They certainly sound like they're an extension of the Iranians. So we can do contingency planning. We can push the normalization process. One of the points that David was raising, the Biden administration had made it very clear they support the Abraham Accords. There's a big difference between passively supporting it and actively promoting it. And it's too soon because we're 2 weeks into the administration to see how the Biden administration will pursue this. But if it's only passive, it will have much less of an effect. And the more you build the normalization process, it isn't, as I said, it's not just good as a way to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. it also cements a coalition in the region that the Iranians see. I can tell you the Iranians were shocked when the Emirates crossed the threshold and began the normalization process. This is another way to, in a sense, contain the Iranians. And you also show the contrast. Think about where the Iranians are, where they have a presence and where they have great weight and where they have great influence. Okay, it's in Iraq, but I'm suggesting we can actually build a counterweight to that. It's in Lebanon, it's in Syria, it's in Yemen. Now, these are states that are either failing or failed. The Iranians don't present anything like a model that is appealing to anybody else in the region. The more the normalization process goes forward, and you heard David talk about what it might mean economically. These are, Arab countries are drawn to Israel now, not only because of security factors and reasons. They're drawn to it because they have acute water problems, and that creates acute food security issues. Israel is a leader in the world in how it uses and reuses wastewater. It reuses nearly 90% of its wastewater. So it expands the water that's available for it. Half of that wastewater that's retreated is used for Israeli agriculture. But Israel has created drought-resistant crops. Wheat and rice are water-intensive crops. They're staples, but they're water-intensive crops. At a time when you have climate change that is producing terrible droughts in the Middle East, water has become much more of an issue. Food security is much more of an issue. And many of these countries see what Israel can offer them. It's interesting, there were many who said when Sudan normalized with Israel, it was going to face all sorts of opposition domestically. We haven't seen that, but we did see the government immediately asked for the Israelis to send agricultural specialists. So we can do more in the normalization area. The point here is you can go down the line of all the things we can do in the region that raise the cost to the Iranians of what they're trying to do in the region and demonstrate we will compete. And the more we show we'll be prepared to compete in the region, the more it will also affect the Iranian choices, and it can enhance and it will appeal, I think, to those who wonder whether we really will apply leverage on the Iranians. We have the means to do that. The important thing will be for the administration with the Congress and with the regional countries as they consult to demonstrate unmistakably they listen to their concerns and they have answers for how to deal with it. Let me just conclude by saying there is no such thing as a negotiation with Iran that will ever be simple. Literally, the Iranians, it's in their DNA when it comes to negotiations, never to do things quickly or easily. But it doesn't mean that diplomacy isn't possible, but diplomacy that isn't backed by a readiness on our part to use force if necessary, but more importantly, to apply all the instrumentalities that give us leverage. It's not just economic. The Trump administration's mistake was to think that all you had to do was put economic pressure on them and they would fold. They obviously didn't. You need to politically isolate them because they don't see themselves as being North Korea. You need to basically build what is a kind of continuing coalition, and you need to show you will compete. If the Biden administration does that, I think they will not only find that they work out a common approach with the Israelis and the regional countries, but ultimately this will promise the most likely way to change Iran's behavior in the region and on the nuclear issue. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador Ross and Mr. Makovsky, for those remarks. I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Ben Lefkowitz. I'm a co-president of EPAC, and I'm on the Hill International Student Cabinet. I'm very excited to help moderate this event with Amanda Cohen. I just want to emphasize quickly, if you do have any questions, I know that was just a lot of information. Please don't be afraid to throw it in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. I'd like to start off with a quick question for both of you, really. One really pivotal moment that I remember growing up was watching John Kerry say that, former Secretary of State John Kerry say that there will never be peace with the Arab states without peace with the Palestinians. Obviously, that idea and that tone has changed with the Abrams Accords. I'm wondering, was he wrong in that initial assessment, or do you think something fundamentally changed in the region for that to happen?
I'll go first at it, and I should disclose that I worked
You want to start since I just talked?
for Secretary of State Kerry. look, I think when he said it, it was accurate about in 2015, or whatever the year was that he said it. But what's changed is what I try to say in my remarks is this sense of America is retrenching from the region, pivoting to Asia. And we saw both the Obama administration and the Trump administration pull troops out of the Middle East. And that gave, as I try to say in my remarks, this sense of a sense of America is pulling back. And usually in vacuums, the vacuums are not filled by positive actors. They're filled by actors who wish America ill. And so I think in a certain way, they were responding to a reality as they saw it, that every day America is saying, we're energy independent now. We don't need the Middle East. We don't need the Middle East. And as they said to me in Abu Dhabi, among the Emirati national security officials, you know, if you keep saying you don't need the Middle East in America, at a certain point, we hear it. And so I think this sense of new energy dynamics in this country because of fracking, alternative energy, all sorts of things that made America a net exporter is made these people believe that, can we really count on America? When they talked to me, it was right after President Trump had said, you know, with the pulling out of Syria, with the Kurdish area, after the Kurds had spent 11,000 fatalities, you know, fighting ISIS. I think we lost 6 people. The Kurds lost 11,000. So they said, like, who's going to be there for us? And I think the fact that they could, you know, feel that they could count on Israel tells you about their sense of an appreciation of Israeli military power, and a sense that they feel that they have to deal with a very fluid geopolitical situation. So what might have been true in 2015, I don't think is the same dynamic in 2020. But I don't know, Dennis may feel differently.
No, the only thing I would say is I think that the Kerry statement was always overstated. It reflected a traditional assumption that the Palestinian issue was the core of all problems in the region. The book I wrote before the one I did with David was called Doomed to Succeed, and it went through every administration from Truman to Obama. And one of the assumptions, I think Secretary Kerry was someone who very much believed in it. What David is saying is the kind of changes we're seeing that are in the open now, they were beginning to emerge even then. The UAE had a relationship with Israel that dated from at least 2009, but it began to become public in 2015 when they allowed Israel to have a diplomatic office in the International Renewable Energy Agency. So there was a tendency, old habits die hard, and old kind of assessments tend to die hard as well. So I think it was, even then it was an exaggeration, but the reality was at that time, Arab states, at least in open discussion with us, weren't at that point prepared to go in a different direction. Had there been more of a push by the administration, maybe things would have been different. But I think now, you know, the underlying realities that were already beginning to express themselves then, now it's very different. And it's, you know, one of the key points, I just wanted to add something that David said during his presentation. The key thing that's changed is that Arab states not only don't make the Palestinian issue their priority, they don't fear the Palestinian ability to mobilize passion against them and destabilize them. Historically, they did. The sense was the cause of Palestine was so emotive, and it was seen and it was so socialized into kind of the, you know, into the psychological sense of everyone in the region, that it would be risky to look like you were prepared to do something that the Palestinians would oppose. That's not the case. When David described the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, what you saw was that fear is gone. It doesn't mean the cause of Palestine has no resonance, but it's not a priority issue and it doesn't create that kind of fear. And that's what suggests that the region is quite different.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, if restoring American leadership is a key element for the future of the Middle East, what impact does Russia have in the equation?
Dennis, you start.
Okay. I think, again, Russia is hardly a model. It's a little bit like Iran. You know, are the Russians exerting their power? Yes. They're in Libya. They're obviously the main player in Syria. But the truth is, when you have countries that are thinking in terms of how do they address the needs of their people, they don't look at the Russians as being capable of providing that. Will some of the Arab states, will they seek to try to suggest to us that if we're not more responsive to them, they may tilt towards the Russians or tilt towards the Chinese? Yes, they will. The more we push on issues that, like human rights, which is part of who we are, part of our values, they may try to resist that, but it's not, there's a limited source of attraction to the Russians. For Putin has used the appearance of Russia being successful on the world stage as dealing with, what was the sense of loss of stature and status that the collapse of the Soviet Union produced. I think we've always underestimated the psychological trauma that the collapse of the Soviet Union had for Russians because it was such a part of their identity. Now, Putin has reestablished a sense that we're a great player on the world stage. But even that's beginning to wear thin because you're seeing if he wasn't afraid of the charges of corruption that Navalny has, in a sense, highlighted, you wouldn't see right now. You wouldn't see a lot of the efforts to disrupt any possibility in terms of protests. This is a sign of Russian weakness, not a sign of Russian strength. And don't assume that it's lost somehow in the Middle East. It's not.
Just saying, to pick up what Dennis said, I mean, Russia doesn't have the set of alliances we have. They don't have a NATO. There's no multiplier out there. The Europeans, others, there's nobody kind of, resonating the Russian message in a way that would have force. And the Arabs know it. Yes. Will they say, look, if you don't sell us America, we'll buy something from the Russians? Yeah, because tactically, why not? It's a way of trying to get the best deal you can from America. And to say we're not necessarily in your pocket, I get that. But, since the Arab Spring, and I said that in my remarks, Dennis said it, I think there's this belief you got to deliver for your public. You can't just distract them by saying I have foreign enemies. And Russia is not a country that people look to improve their standard of living for their people. So I think they have a very narrow appeal. I will say for Israel though, and I'm very sympathetic with Israel's predicament, as Dennis pointed out, because the Iranians are in Syria, and yet the Russians control the skies of Syria. They did it in 2015 when they were told that Assad is going down. They got to save Assad. So they brought in their Air Force. They don't send troops on the ground. They let other people fight, but they'll control the air. So the Israelis feel that they have to have a modus vivendi with Putin in terms of if they want to strike Iran. They don't want to, they want to deconflict. They don't want to conflict with Russian airplanes in the skies. Sometimes the Israeli missiles are from Tiberias. They're from Israeli airspace, and then the rockets go from Israeli airspace into an Iranian target in Syria. But that means they need a relationship. So while I say that the Russians have very limited international appeal, at the same time, Israel's got to deal with it, especially at the time where the last administration was not viewed as someone that, for whatever the complicated dynamics with Trump, felt that they could handle the Russian account. As Dennis likes to point out, usually on the Middle East, Israel can, kind of take care of itself, but internationally, there was a sense of the US handling the Russia account, but that wasn't the case. So Israel had to do it. Israel had no choice because they're facing this reality of Iran on their doorstep. If they didn't like Hezbollah on their Lebanese doorstep, you didn't like the book in Lebanon, you don't want to see the movie in Syria. So you got to understand why Israel has to do what it has to do, but it doesn't mean that it's a matter of choice, and it's a sense of looking up to Putin. It should not be interpreted in that context.
Okay, we have another question. To what extent do you think the current Congress understands your analysis and assessment of the Middle East and the U.S.'s role? How much does congressional leadership understand this rank and file?
Dennis, you want to start here too?
Yeah, I think you have to understand when you say Congress, there are 435 members, and in the House of Representatives, another 100 in the Senate. So there isn't one view. There are those on the foreign affairs, armed services, and intelligence committees who pay much more attention to these issues. And even here, there isn't a consensus. I would say generally, there certainly is, the mainstream in the Congress appreciates Israel's role. And I would even say there are concerns, not just on the Republican side on the issue of the JCPOA. There are very prominent senators, including the majority leader now, who actually voted against the JCPOA. He rejected the JCPOA. Ben Cardin, a ranking member, a ranking Democrat, and Menendez, Senator Menendez, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, they were all against, all Democrats, all against the JCPOA. So this means that as it relates to Iran and as it relates to Israel's concerns, there is, I think, a significant number on the Hill, not just Republicans, who the administration is going to have to reach out to and explain. That's what I was trying to get at, to explain the significance of leverage. Now, having said that, on an issue like Saudi Arabia, there's also a consensus that is increasingly believing that there needs to be some kind of punishment of the Saudis for their transgressions. You know, the killing, the horrific killing of Khashoggi, the way they conducted the war in Yemen. Interestingly enough, I think what President Biden did in his foreign policy speech by announcing we're not going to support their military campaign any longer in Yemen, by appointing a new envoy for Yemen, and by saying we still will provide material defense for the territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia, he struck a very interesting balance, because I think the impression of saying we're not going to support the Saudi campaign in Yemen any longer had the virtue of creating a sense that he was imposing a price on the Saudis, even as he was signaling the Saudis that we're not going to walk away from our responsibilities for your defense. So I think the administration is positioning itself pretty well in Saudi Arabia. And I'll just conclude by this point by saying there is no important issue that we deal with in the Middle East, whether it's Iran, or whether it's Yemen, whether it's the normalization process with Israel and Arab states, whether it's Syria, Libya. There is no issue in the Middle East trying to counter terrorism and radical Islamic ideology. None of these are possible without active Saudi participation. So the administration has its work cut out in striking a certain kind of balance. And that, while the Iranian view, I think there's an understanding of Iran that is, I think, more sophisticated on the Hill than many people believe, at least as it relates to many of the relevant committees. On Saudi Arabia, the administration will have its work cut out for it. But I think in general, there is mainstream support for Israel on the Hill.
I'll just add on this is about Egypt, because this is also a case, and I think with the Emirates, when they did the deal that they did, to Ben's question, I mean, part of it is I think the Emiratis thought they were like purchasing a form of political risk insurance, that they were somehow vulnerable because they were associated with the Saudis, even though they left the Yemeni war already a while ago, and they're trying to differentiate themselves from the Saudis. They don't want to be brought into conversations about the Khashoggi affair, which has nothing to do with them, of course. And they know the anger in the Democratic side about the Saudis. But I think, so for the Emirates, I think they said, look, peace is a consensus issue on the Hill. This is, and I think while they were broader, it had to have its logic on its own, like I was trying to explain about the region, the dynamics, the vacuum, and the economics, and the diversification for post-oil. The idea of clinching it before an election in the US was to also position itself on the Hill post-election for a post-Trump era. I think another country that's a bit nervous is Egypt. Egypt is the first country to normalize with Israel. And ironically, Egypt is the country where Israel has been working with Egypt probably closer now than it ever has, because they're working together against ISIS in the Sinai. And Egypt has been pivotal in maintaining this kind of de facto ceasefire in Gaza. And, when you talk to Egyptian officials, they go, well, people on the Hill remember all the good things that we do behind the scenes. We don't send out press releases that we're doing this stuff. but we're doing it. And this is in America's interest, and this is in Israel's interest, and it's in our interest. And I think there's a kind of a nervousness of of two Arab countries, is the Saudis and the Egyptians, about is there this pent up resentment on the Hill against them. And I think the fact that Tony Blinken really threaded the needle nicely, as Dennis pointed out, by saying, we're not going to sell offensive weapons on Yemen, but we want to make sure we're protecting Saudi Arabia with defensive weapons. I hope that same kind of balance is felt on the Egyptian account, because I think there's a kind of a nervousness there too about Congress. So I hope the administration can find the right tone of balance, the way it struck on the Saudis. Again, these are early days. We don't know how things will play out. COVID is the elephant in the room that's overwhelming everything. But if I had to get to Ben's question about where's Congress on Middle East, I would look to these two countries as bellwethers in a certain way that are a bit nervous, and they're hoping that their friendship with Israel is a big boost for them in Washington on Capitol Hill. We'll have to see if it is, but I mean, it's come a long way from a time where, the Arab countries want to have nothing to do with Israel, to the point that they feel, well, Israel's good for them on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. It's a really amazing, dramatic shift that's been going on. So we'll have to follow that.
So this is our final question. It's actually a personal question. So as student leaders, should we engage with groups on campus, such as Students for Justice in Palestine, who seek to undermine Israel's legitimacy and support BDS? If so, in what capacity and how?
What was the first? I understood the last part. What was the first part of the question? I didn't quite get it.
I just wanted to know, like, as student leaders, specifically for those of us that are on Emory University's campus, we kind of face the group Students for Justice in Palestine, who seek to undermine Israel's legitimacy, and they don't really want anything to do with us. They won't really discuss us. But do you guys think that it would be in our best interest as pro-Israel activists on campus to engage with these groups, and in what capacity?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think you ever chase after anybody. The problem is they don't want to talk to you because they actually want to perpetuate the conflict. I mean, I've spent 30 years trying to resolve the conflict, and they want to import it from the Middle East to the campuses, number one. They reject the idea of dialogue. There's no such thing as conflict resolution if you can't talk. There's no dialogue. The idea that you can't have a dialogue on a college campus, it's like an oxymoron. If you can't have a dialogue on a college campus, it means you can't explore things. If there's such a meaning of free speech, it ought to be, and in a sense, exploration, it ought to be on a college campus. So I think it's important for you to emphasize you believe in dialogue. If those groups don't want to do it, then fine. There may be, there can be Muslim student organizations that are willing to engage in interfaith dialogue. Pursue that. And I wouldn't let these groups define what can be done. They want to basically, as I said, they want to perpetuate the conflict. They don't want to resolve it. They're not about two states, they're one state. Their definition of one state has very little place in it, basically has no place in it for Israel. I think it's, on the one hand, it's important to expose what their real views are. On the other hand, it's important to emphasize you believe in peace, you're willing to engage in dialogue. You can offer dialogue to them. If they want to reject it, let them reject it.
Yeah, I think it's so ironic, Amanda, that this is coming at a time that all these Arab states are normalizing with Israel. When you see the Emirati ambassador saying Israel is an opportunity and not a threat, he always says it. Israel's an opportunity. This is good for the Arabs to be closer with Israel. This is a new world we're in. And I feel like some of the people on some of these campuses, they're like the Japanese, no one's told them the war is over. That they're still fighting World War II after the war is over. So there's a different dynamic out in the region that I feel they're behind the times on. And, you know, the campus in theory was always supposed to be ahead of the curve. And yet I feel on this issue, sadly, the campuses are behind the curve. They still want to finger point against Israel in a way when, you know, these people are now looking into things like we heard from Dennis about, you know, what we talked about water desalination and all these things that could have really good implications for poor countries in Africa and the like. And they feel Israel is part of the solution and not part of the problem. And it's sadly the campus, it's a different dynamic. Also, just analytically, you know, the campuses should not be importing the worst elements of the Middle East of confrontation, non-dialogue, the whole, as Dennis pointed out, I mean, the hallmark of American democracy is political pluralism and dialogue. That's what we should be exporting. And it's sad to me that they're trying to import something else. But look, it's, you know, the one-staters, they're one-staters. I mean, you know, we at the Washington Institute did something a few summers ago. I hope Dennis remembers this. We gathered a lot of Arab Americans, college students who were in SJP, and we just had an off-the-record conversation with them. And they said, each of them had left SJP, and they said the following. They said, how could we exist on a college campus and expect people to recognize Palestine if we don't recognize Israel? It makes no sense. So the organization, but those were the rules from above, and we couldn't change it. And how is it that we can't sit with Hillel students? They said, it's crazy. They're Americans. We're Americans. There's no basis for that. If we can't sit with American students, we're not legitimate. So, I mean, I think they have the broader problem at this point in this regard. I'm not saying, you know, it could be there's certain campuses that I found, I think I've been, and Dennis also has done it about, I think I've done I was at 148 campuses before the COVID, and that doesn't include all the Zooms. There's some campuses where the SJP local leadership is different, but for the most part, this rule is pretty much enforced. Now, can you find people at the margins that someone's roommate, this one is in my chemistry class, and you have personal relationships? Great. But as Dennis said, I wouldn't chase it. If they don't want to do it, don't do it. But there's other alliances. Dennis mentioned the Muslim Students Association. Often people from Asia and other places, there are alliances you could do. But I think that they really don't have a leg to stand on, frankly, given all these new dynamics and given with the fact that they are the ones who are spurning dialogue. And so I sympathize with you, Amanda, because we see it in other places, but I think you just got to stay cool and take the high ground in this debate. And look, I would be for looking for things also that would bring Muslim American, Jewish American kids together, maybe post-COVID, to have like alternative spring breaks, that you do social action projects together for the Israelis and for Palestinians over there. But I looked at polling data of campuses, and they said, why people don't like SJP? They said, because they're ripping our community apart. I feel any group that rips a community apart by being divisive and saying, I don't want to even talk to you, those people over time don't win. So I would look for the unifiers and work around them, and don't chase them if they don't want to talk. If you could identify a couple of reasonable ones, great. But if you can't, I don't think there should be a cause for despair.
Thank you both so much. This was super informative, and thank you guys for answering the questions. We really appreciate everyone who attended and everybody who helped behind the scenes. I'd like to thank Elliot from Hillel for organizing this event and for including Ben and I as co-moderators. It was really an honor to speak to you guys and to co-moderate this event. I really look forward to continuing hearing you guys. I'm currently reading your book. It's awesome. I suggest that everyone in this meeting get the book, read the book, and just stay on top of this because this is a super important topic right now.
By the way, you should be getting the book. If you haven't gotten it, thanks to the generosity of the Grinspoon Foundation, any college student who comes to our events or whatever wants to get the book gets a free book. So I hope you'll be inspired by the stories of leadership. We should have, we had so much that we wanted to get in. We didn't really get a chance. How about the book? Or a podcast on decision points on key moments in the U.S.-Israel relationship or Arab-Israeli peacemaking, really super dramatic moments. But we just think that there's some inspirational stories out there that could hopefully propel people forward, and we hope it's useful to you.
Yes, thank you so much again. As Mr. Makovsky just said, everyone who came to this event should be getting the book in the mail soon. And thank you again to Elliot, Hillels of Georgia, Mr. Makovsky and Ambassador Ross for being here tonight. I just want to remind everyone that you can follow EPAC Hillels of Georgia and Emory Hillel on Instagram and all social media platforms. You can also find more information about what EPAC does at EmoryIsraelPAC.com. We have lots of events, and Hillels of Georgia is also having more events coming up. Thank you all again, and thank you everyone for coming tonight too.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.